Thank you, and thank you, Nancy, for such a well, wonderful but also terrifying survey of the state. You know, I oftentimes with the Trump administration, as you mentioned, the distraction of the tweets, it goes back and forth between, you know, every 1 second thinking that Trump is unprecedented. You know, this is some rupture in American tradition. On the other hand, the next tweet comes out and it's like he's the culmination of the American tradition. You know, he's, you know, deep history of it. But I thought maybe we could just start by setting the scene. You mentioned there's the serendipity of finding the documents about the vouchers with the American Friends Service Archive. But in your book, you have this lovely introduction about stumbling into the Buchanan house, and you use the metaphor of like they left, you know, for an organization, the Koch brothers, you know, and all of the, you know, the mercantilist center, they're doing their evil deeds over in their high financed and polished building, but they left the actual back door open, and you just kind of wandered in and found the documents. And I don't know, could you maybe just explain that a little bit? It's great. Sure. It's a great part of the book.
And it was just really interesting because before I got in 2013, as I said, you know, I had moved to North Carolina and I was seeing all of this happen. And as I was seeing the connections between these various measures and Buchanan's thought, I also started following how many of these organizations were financed, and I was seeing the Koch money and the network and stuff behind them. And it was really chilling, but I will tell you there was a moment where, people here watch Homeland? Anybody know that? Remember the Claire Danes character?
Yeah.
You know, and she's always on to something, but you're like, does she know something or does she need meds? and I got to the point where I started to feel like I was the lady with the files, you know? It's like this just seemed preposterous even to me for a while, but I kept seeing it, and so I persisted in the language of the past year. But I wasn't able to get access to the archive, and long story, make it short, I did finally get in 2013, in September of 2013, which was also totally surreal because at that moment the federal government was being shut down by Ted Cruz in the leadership, applying Buchanan's notion of coercive bargaining. So it was just crazy to be listening to that on the radio and then going into this archive. And it wasn't really an archive. It was an old clapboard house that had been the mansion of a previous president at George Mason that they gave to Buchanan and his team when they were hired. And it was essentially a working office, and there were files everywhere, and, you know, including the old ones were under a stairwell, and, you know, stuff stacked on them in no particular order. As a historian, I had never been in such a place, and everything was a mess. But I just, you know, started methodically going through. And found the earlier years worth of stuff in the first floor, and then the second floor when I got into his office was where some of the shockers were, including his correspondence with the leading thinker of the Pinochet regime, in which Buchanan thanked him after his trip for the fine lunch that he'd held in Buchanan's honor, and the flowers and the jewelry for Mrs. Buchanan, and all of this stuff. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this regime was like one of the worst human rights violators of its era. I mean, it helped generate the human rights movement because it was so murderous. And here was this guy sending lovely thank you notes for his visit, and I just found, you know, I was thinking, who is this? Where are these ideas coming from? You know, and found them. But it was kind of fun to be underestimated, as I think they're doing to the American people, because these guys, you know, they're dogmatic, right? And so they reason from their prior assumptions. They're mostly economists and legal scholars, if they're academics, sometimes philosophers. Almost none are historians, and that's because we deal with the real world and with evidence, right? So I think they just couldn't even imagine that all of these records could be useful to someone and would expose what they had done and what they had built and why they were doing it and what the end game was. So it was quite something.
I mean, I have an image of you bicycling past the Mercantile Center, waving to them as they're working, as you're going into the. Yeah, I mean, they had no idea what you were doing. You just were.
No idea.
They had no idea.
And
Did they even know
they
you were
really
there?
hadn't left any of their people there. It was just crazy. Because also they betrayed Buchanan at the end. And sorry, spoiler alert for the last chapter. But they betrayed him, and so he wanted to stay away from them because he thought what they were doing at his institution was so grotesque. So they all went off to their fancy new center in Alexandria and left his place. But it was funny, when I went to DC for a later trip, I was doing some stuff in Fairfax, and the person who was hosting me couldn't find me a parking space. So finally she took me to it's now renamed the Scalia School of Law after Antonin Scalia. And the Mercatus Center is on a floor of that. And so I parked under it, and I felt like spy, counter spy, tried to hide my North Carolina license plate, make sure no copies of Democracy in Chains were in the car.
Well, Democracy in Chains is really a wonderful book. I mean, it really does bring together a lot of the different pieces. I mean, there's been histories of the intellectual trajectory of neoliberalism, it's another word for Reaganomics, Thatcherism, this, cult of the marketplace and the reduction of, the individual and reducing public policy to market solutions, all of that stuff. There's been works that looked at the Austrian school, the Chicago school, and I mean, what your work does is not only does it bring in the South and show the deep racial roots of neoliberalism, of what we would call neoliberalism, but then also, as you laid out just now, link it to money and money power, right? So it's not just the triumph. I mean, on the one hand, it's not just the triumph of the ideas. It's not just the natural contradictions within Fordism or Keynesianism. It's this, this movement funded by the Koch brothers that they just latch onto it, and so it's in 2008 that they take over the Republican Party. Just that you have that date.
They were working toward that for some time, and if you look at the hiring patterns, for example, there's a lot of movement between Koch Industries and these various other wings of the Koch network's operation. So people will go from Koch Industries to things like the Independent Women's Federation. You might have heard of them, or to all these different groups. Some of them have cycled in and out of important Republican positions, both in the National Party and in the states, particularly in Virginia. But they really got going and got serious after the election of President Obama. But the groundwork had already been laid. But I think it was kind of like, this is our moment. Plus, then the Tea Party arose, and they quickly saw that they could also weaponize this grassroots hostility to the Obama administration in quite the way that Buchanan, had looked to the rage against Brown versus Board of Education to promote school privatization. So, can I say, maybe just say one thing there too that I think is important to underscore on this stealth stuff? One of the things that has been so disturbing to me about researching this Koch operation is their essential dishonesty with even their own people. And so, for example, the best study that we have of the Tea Party by two sociologists, leading sociologists, Theda Scotchpole and Vanessa Williams, they went out and talked to every single grassroots Tea Party member they could find around the country. They did ethnographies, they went to meetings, they talked to, probably well over 1,000 people from all different parts of the country, maybe even more, I don't know. But what they said is that they could not find a single grassroots member of the Tea Party who wanted to see the privatization of Social Security and Medicare. But that is exactly what these authors said the roving billionaires were using them as a battering ram to do. And so that is just what's so chilling. And also my spouse has gotten on the mailing list of these groups just so we can see, what they're sending to their own members. And it's just so deceitful. So Americans for Prosperity, for example, sends out these mailings about the recent tax bill saying things like, we're going to limit government and put more of your hard-earned money in your pocket. End of story. Right? Like nothing about the way that this is loading the deck so that they can undermine Social Security and Medicare, so that they can set up this constitutional convention, so that they can wipe out things that even many Republican voters and Americans for Prosperity activists like. So it's just so profoundly cynical. It really took my breath away. And that's why some people have kind of teased me that, I don't know, I guess I have kind of a hopeful affect while I have this horrifying story. But part of the reason for that is, well, first I teach the history of social movements, and we did abolition a few weeks ago. And frankly, if you want to think you have a hard uphill, struggle, think about abolitionists, 62 people coming together against the most profitable system of their time that was supported by all the elites everywhere throughout their society, and yet. But anyway, the other reason I'm hopeful, though, is that I think that the fact that this cause is so afraid of the majority, so determined to work behind our backs and to stack the deck so that people's opinion, people's weighing in on the political process is negated. The fact that they're doing all this suggests to me that there's a colossal power out there among us, right? If people are informed about this agenda, if people are activated, and if they realize that this is an all-hands-on-deck moment, that what happens in the next few years is going to determine the future. For time, I thought, thank you.
Yeah. But that contradiction between what the rank and file thinks it's doing and what the agenda is by the elites, I mean, in some ways that's embodied in the Trump administration. You have the Trump running up, at least rhetorically populist, we're going to save Social Security, and then, but having Mike Pence as his vice president and the tax bill, I mean, and the deregulation. So it's that contradiction is now the governing. It's now structures the governing class. It's quite amazing. Yeah.
And I think this is a situation, too, in which we've been ill-served by most of our media, which suffers from attention deficit disorder, I have concluded, because they've really, and there are some really shining exceptions.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about Stormy Daniels.
Jane Mayer, Alex Koch, there's some really, really terrific journalists who are on this beat. But for most of the media, there's the assumption that the Koch story was the story up till 2015. And since 2016, it's Donald Trump all the time. And it's like so many of them don't even ask the fundamental questions about how these things connect. There are some people now who are showing that Trump is absolutely surrounded by people who have been thoroughly trained in the Koch network, who are committed to it, from Mike Pence to Scott Pruitt, to all of these folks, on down, including some of the people who are most close to the president himself. So I really think that we've been played and we've been had on this. I mean, this Koch agenda is moving through so rapidly under the Trump administration, while they're laughing at us, I think, for thinking that we're smart and thinking that Trump is stupid and spending all our time commenting on these tweets. Well, here's what I suggest. Let me put this a different way. One thing I've been suggesting to audience is something that I think will give you great pleasure and really help our political process, and that is to take time out Trump. Yeah, take like a week. Plan on this, right? And it's going to be good. It's going to be good for your mental health. It's going to be good for your digestion. It's just going to be good. And make a commitment that you will pay no attention to this man whatsoever, right? You're not going to listen to his tweets. You're not going to read the 7 out of 10 articles that are all about Trump and Russia and all that other stuff. You're not going to pay any attention to that. What you're going to pay attention to for that week is what's going on in your state that matters to you, what's going on in federal departments and agencies that matters to you. Like, do you care about discrimination? Under the Trump administration, with the advice of the Koch people, anti-discrimination measures are being undermined in every single department and agency of the federal government. Do you care about the environment? We're having the most radical undermining of environmental legislation, of global warming protection, of everything else that we could do. The Department of Labor, what's going on in the Supreme Court, all of these areas desperately need our focus and our attention and our action. And if we could all just take that Time Out Trump week, and who knows, maybe it'll just turn into Time Out Trump period. You'll just start ignoring him. Then we can get on to the real issues that are shaping our country.
Yeah, and obviously those contradictions could play out a base that keep your hand, keep the government off on Medicare and that kind of thing, and the West Virginia strike and things like that. Maybe the beginning of the fractures, but I certainly think that that's absolutely true. It's that it requires such enormous deceit and repression because it's so profoundly unpopular.
Yes.
The agenda, and it's unsustainable. There will always be collective collectivities emerging that wants a community not defined by the market or by the individual. I come at a lot of this through Latin America, and you talk about Burnham's visit to Chile, and Milton Friedman was also his famous kind of pilgrimage to Chile, to Pinochet, and so did Hayek. So that's well integrated into the history of neoliberalism. But what's striking to me about American exceptionalism compared with the political culture of other Latin American countries is just how much work it takes to suppress the idea of social rights. You talk about this new constitution that they want to, the old constitution is pretty restrictive to begin with.
Yeah.
That's not exactly, the most generous, generative document in terms of rights. It's based on individual rights, restraining the state, a notion of freedom from restraint, allowing people to talk and to bear and to hold and to possess, and all of those negative rights, negative in the sense. Latin America, equal to those political rights is the belief in social rights, the right to health care, the right to education. And that, for me, going back to the 2016 campaign, what was so radical about Bernie Sanders, setting aside his what strengths or weaknesses as a candidate, and or whatever, is just his insistence that healthcare is a political right. That itself is such an insurgent, revolutionary, and the vast majority of people believe that now. So on the one hand, you have this organized political movement that's trying to enshrine an even more austere constitution, if they could. And on the other hand, you have a vast majority of millennials that believe social rights are equal to political rights, as in legitimacy. So, that's another source of hope in some ways, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you say about the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is so true. In the conclusion of my book, I have like a little tutorial about the Constitution. But our Constitution has more of what political scientists call veto points than any other constitution in the world. We have 4 of those, in the Electoral College being one, the Senate, all these different ways that there are these speed bumps put in the place of people to make it very, very difficult to enact majoritarian agendas in the United States. And some very distinguished comparative political economists who also did a lot of work on Chile looked at this and noticed also that we have the highest inequality of any of those societies. So it's a correlation, it's not a causation, but you can kind of see that the way that our political system has been structured, it makes it very hard to take significant action to address majority concerns, except in kind of states of popular emergency, like the 1860s, like the 1930s, like the 1960s. You need a huge level of mobilization in America to affect significant change. So the fact that this libertarian cause thinks that this Constitution is inadequate to protect their rights is really gives you, it's really kind of breathtaking about how radical and stark their vision is. And you use the word sustainable, or that it's not sustainable, and I'm glad you raised that, because one of the reasons I feel so strongly about this, and that I've been kind of traveling around the country talking to as many audiences as I can about this, is because I believe that what these people, we can already see it happening, first of all, but if they go farther, they will create a society that is a horror show, that is utterly unsustainable by any measure you care to adopt, whether it's socially unsustainable, economically unsustainable, unsustainable in terms of the environment. I've had women coming up to me, mothers coming up to me after talks and saying, I have a disabled child. What do these people think is going to happen to, what would happen to my child in this society? And through these conversations, I've started to realize that really what we're looking at here is economic eugenics. Right? At the turn of the 20th century, there was racial eugenics that had this notion that there were good people and good strains and bad strains, and you had to breed the good strains and underbreed the bad strains. And of course, that brought us the Holocaust, at which point those racial eugenic ideas became unpopular. But this cause is deeply social Darwinistic, right? They think that if you haven't made it in their wonderful capitalist society, it's because of you, right? right? You didn't try hard enough. You're suffering in West Virginia because you're too lazy to move. You're suffering here because you're, I mean, they actually write stuff like this. And so to me, it's just, frankly, so repellent that I think people need to know where this is going. But as you're also saying, Greg, I think there's also lots of reasons to hope that people don't want to be in this world they're creating. I mean, one of them is those wonderful students who said, we're the kids, you're the adults. Do something about this, you know, and they've developed this movement which has turned a spotlight on the Republican Party being a captive of the national, and not only is the Republican, it's worse than this, not only is the Republican Party a captive of the National Rifle Association, but it is actually, this Koch network tries to engorge the National Rifle Association with new measures, for example, promoting guns to women, who then they think will join the National Rifle Association because they can make them reliably conservative through their gun ownership, or so Grover Norquist thinks. If you read him, I mean, it's just it's really crazy stuff.
But your book is so useful because it emphasizes not just the money structure, but and the network, but the morality of it. I mean, no matter how perverse it is, there's a morality there. The morality of the individual. There is only an individual, and rights are inherent in individuals. And this, to the degree that there's a state is only legitimate to the degree it protects individual rights. It doesn't distribute social rights. And there's a morality and a vision there that powers that movement, that has deep resonance, even if it's a weaponized version of the Constitution, and wants to make it even worse. You know, one of the things, I mean, I remember reading an article in 2004 around the John Kerry campaign in the New York Times about how left donors, wealthy left donors wanted to create a network, or progressive, not left, but liberal, wanted to create a network equal to the Koch network, right? But there was no ideas. They had, I mean, they didn't even talk about healthcare as a right? So, it was all just about matching the infrastructure, but not the morality, not a counter morality, right? And I think that if we really are going to overcome this, it has to be not just the network, not just the financing, although we don't have the financing like they do, but whatever, we can get those $27 donations, but it also a vision, like a morality that grounds a notion of a common good and a commonwealth, right? And social rights seems to me that there is a right to healthcare, there is a right to education.
I will say, I think some significant progress is being made, like right now, as we meet. I think that particularly, I mean, I think all that went on with the attacks on President Obama, frankly, this theft of that Supreme Court seat by Mitch McConnell, and Donald Trump now, thanks to Mitch McConnell, not allowing President Obama to exercise the prerogatives of a president in putting forth federal judges and having them confirmed. Donald Trump has now appointed in his first year, the most federal judges in our history in a similar period of time. And those seats, I mean, that was rule breaking, right? That was radical rule and norm breaking, to take those seats from a sitting president and hold them in reserve so that their guys could get it in. So they've rigged the deck on our judicial system. So that's really something. But I think all of these things are like really waking up good people and people who are already in motion. And one of the things that's been most exciting to me since the book came out in June, and I've been touring the country pretty extensively since September, is that people are getting this across sectors of the progressive movement, including those folks from what you're talking about as the Democracy Alliance, which now is also seeing the need for ideas. But I mean, you look at labor, numerous labor unions, community groups like the Center for Popular Democracy, Amnesty International, I just spoke with their board recently, National Council of Churches, where am I? Most of the major environmental groups, everybody is saying, this is so not normal. This is a crisis situation, and people are talking about rethinking their strategy in light of that. Right. And so several things are happening from that, but in the conversations that I've been having with folks, they are talking about the fact that this cause, however much you may dislike their vision, it is a coherent vision, and they have great message discipline, and they harp on it all the time, whereas the left is just like, kind of like just scatter, right? And there is no clarity, there is no through line, there is no framing of values that drive the agenda. So people are hungering for that kind of unifying framework to communicate better to people why we stand for the things that we do. That's one thing. But the other thing that's really impressive is people seem to really want to get out of silos, and to make new relationships, to walk with other groups, to do the kind of reinvention that the environmental movement did with environmental justice, but on a much larger scale. And so that is happening. And also people are seeing, look, these guys got where they got by playing a very long game. A very long game that took ideas seriously, that worked on strategy, and that, as Charles Koch, he said, what they needed was a set of interrelated plays that would make liberty self-reinforcing. Right? Yeah. That's what we're voter suppression. Think voter suppression, destroying unions, engorging the NRA. All these things work together. To solidify that structure so that people who don't like that vision and want to stop it and want to renew and reinvent democracy then have to think about, well, what are the interrelated plays on the other side, right? How can you play defense against this operation in a way that moves into offense, that lays groundwork for winning over the long term? So I do think this is a really fruitful and productive period. It's a tight time frame, but I think anybody who is interested in being part of this and getting involved, just so many groups. I've even forgot, like some of the ones like Common Cause. A lot of people are working on these issues with a new sense of clarity and urgency and hunger for connection with others.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That makes me hopeful.
Well, that's good. I think we're running out of time,
okay.
And I think that's a great place to end. Should we end with that joke about Rand Paul, Ayn Rand, and Charles Koch going into a bar?
And you take it. You've set it up.
And they all die because they're given poisoned water because there's no government regulation. Thank you, Nancy.
That was fun. Thank you.
That's wonderful. It was really great.